Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast alternates between an interview with a guest or multiple guests and a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship. In this week's particular episode, I'm unpacking a paper by Peter Denning titled Remaining Trouble Spots with Computational Thinking, Addressing Unresolved Questions Concerning Computational Thinking. There is no abstract for this particular paper. However, if I were to summarize this into a single sentence, I would say that this short article answers three questions. What is computational thinking? How do we measure students' computational abilities? And is computational thinking good for everyone? This particular paper is available for free, and you can easily access it by clicking on the title in the show notes, which you can find by clicking the link in the description or by going to jaredoleary.com and clicking on podcasts. All right, so the paper begins with the author describing some problems that they see with computational thinking that we as a field still need to address, at least at the time of writing in 2017. Here's a quote from page 33. Quote, around 2006, the promoters of the CS for All K-12 education movement claimed all people could benefit from thinking like computer scientists. Unfortunately, in attempts to appeal to other fields besides CS, they offered vague and confusing definitions of computational thinking. As a result, today's teachers and education researchers struggle with three main questions. What is computational thinking? How can it be assessed? Is it good for everyone? End quote. So the author goes on to argue that basically these claims about the benefits of computational thinking are unsubstantiated, and that there is a problem with overgeneralizing or broadening terms such as algorithm. Here's a quote again from page 33. Quote, an algorithm is not any sequence of steps, but a series of steps that control some abstract machine or computational model without requiring human judgment. Computational thinking includes designing the model, not just the steps to control it. End quote. Now, this is something that I'll actually rant about at the end of this particular podcast episode, so stay tuned. So continuing on with the intro, the author has some questions that I'm going to quote from page 34. So these questions are related to teachers who are K-12 teachers who are unsure, well, exactly what is computational thinking, and here are some of the questions that the author poses. So one is, quote, how can they be effective if not sure about what they are teaching and how to assess it? End quote. And a little bit further down in the page, quote, is it really true that any sequence of steps is an algorithm? That procedures of daily life are algorithms? That people who use computational tools will need to be computational thinkers? That people who learn computational thinking will be better problem solvers in all fields? That computational thinking is superior to other modes of thought? End quote. Okay, so these are some excellent questions that I too have been grappling with. And in fact, the interview with Stacy Mason and Peter Rich, Peter actually recommended that I read this article because it aligned with some of the things that I was saying. If you haven't listened to that episode, make sure you check it out. I'll link to it in the show notes. All right, so the first main section outside of the intro is the first question. What is computational thinking? So the author goes on to describe a very short summary of basically the history of computational thinking over the last several decades, and cites some sources as early as like the 1940s. However, it wasn't until 2006 when Jeanette Wing published a paper that computational thinking really started to have some traction in the field and beyond. Now, the author notes that there are many different definitions of computational thinking, and because of that, it is a problem for K-12 educators to really be able to define what it is, because there are so many contradictory ways of thinking about computational thinking. Now, after this summary, the author points out two things that they see as problematic about the current pervasive definitions of computational thinking. One is that there is an absence of computational models within these discussions. So here's a quote from pages 35 and 36. Quote, this is a mistake. We engage with abstraction, decomposition, data representation, and so forth in order to get a model to accomplish certain work. End quote. So in other words, you're not just engaging in abstraction for the sake of engaging in abstraction or decomposition on its own. You're doing these things in order to create some kind of a model, at least according to the author. So it's situating those skills or understandings within a context in which you are creating a model. And I think this is a really important thing for us to think about. Like, are we just doing these things because we think decomposition is a good thing? Well, if so, why are we calling it decomposition if it is on its own? Is it decomposition when it is only related to computer science or computational modeling that we are engaging in? What about in other fields? Like if I'm learning how to use a new drum technique, is that decomposition when I'm breaking it down into smaller motions or things to understand? I'd argue they're two different things, and I'll rant about that later. Now, the second suggestion for this particular question is as follows. Here's a quote from page 36. Quote, the other is a suggestion contained in the operational definition that any sequence of steps constitutes an algorithm. True, an algorithm is a series of steps, but the steps are not arbitrary. They must control some computational model. A step that requires human judgment has never been considered to be an algorithmic step. Let us correct our computational thinking guidelines to accurately reflect the definition of an algorithm. Otherwise, we will miseducate our children on the most basic idea. End quote. Totally resonates with me, and again, I'll rant about that later. Okay, so the next section of the paper is question 2, and that question is, how do we measure students' computational abilities? What the author is basically arguing is that we tend to focus on computational thinking as a knowledge rather than as a skill that we use, and they would prefer that we see it as a skill. Here's a quote from page 36, quote, "We test students' knowledge, but not their competence or their sensibilities. Thus, it is possible that a student who scores well on tests to explain and illustrate abstraction and decomposition can still be an incompetent or insensitive algorithm designer." End quote. Now, they go on to argue that this is problematic, and industry professionals know it, which is one of the reasons why they don't just look at your diplomas and your transcripts, but they actually engage in problem-solving interview questions and tests and whatnot that you have to complete in order to actually work at the organization. They want to make sure that you don't just know computational thinking or computer science or coding or whatever, but can actually apply those understandings in the context in which you would need them for work. And so the author is arguing that we, as educators, should focus on computational thinking as a competence that is being assessed, not just a knowledge that was being assessed. So here's a final quote from page 37, quote, "Given that so much education is formulated around students acquiring knowledge, looking carefully at skill development in computational thinking is a new and challenging idea. We will benefit our students by learning to approach and assess computational thinking as a skill." End quote. Okay, so far, here's a quick recap. The author has been arguing that we as a field need to define what computational thinking is, and they would prefer to see it include or center around modeling. In other words, applying computational thinking for some kind of a purpose. And that in order to measure these things, we need to measure the skills, not just the knowledge. Kids need to be able to do something with computational thinking, not just know what abstraction is or how to decompose something, decontextualize from actual application. Okay, so the third question and the third main section of this paper is the question, is computational thinking good for everyone? According to the author, they would argue that the claims around computational thinking being good for everybody are false and unsubstantiated, and that it is going off of this false premise that, quote, "Experienced computational designers believe they are sharper and more precise in their thinking and are better problem solvers," end quote, from page 37. Now, the author argues over the next couple of pages that, yeah, computational thinking is of use for some professions, for people who design computations. However, quote, "It is reasonable to question whether computational thinking is of immediate use for professionals who do not design computations. For example, physicians, surgeons, psychologists, architects, artists, lawyers, ethicists, realtors, and more. Some of these professionals may become computational designers when they modify tools, for example, by adding scripts to document searchers, but not everybody. It would be useful to see some studies of how essential computational thinking is in those professions," end quote, from pages 37 and 38. Now, in 38, they go on to provide a couple of arguments. One is an example of, well, do architects who engage in CADs and develop VR, do they actually need to engage in computational thinking? And they argue, no, not necessarily. They might. And another argument is that just engaging in computational tools does not actually develop computational thinking. So they point out the so-called digital natives and how kids are using devices and whatnot all the time, but does that necessarily mean they're engaging in computational thinking? And the author argues, and I would agree, that no, that does not guarantee they're actually engaging in computational thinking. Now, going back to the argument of, is tying your shoes considered to be an algorithm, here's another claim that the author argues against, and this is from page 38. Quote, "Another claim suggested in the operational definitions is that computational thinking will help people perform everyday procedural tasks better. For example, packing a knapsack, caching needed items close by, or sorting a list of customers. There is no evidence to support this claim. Being a skilled performer of actions that could be computational does not necessarily make you a computational thinker, and vice versa." End quote. From page 38. So in other words, just because we can call it computational thinking, it doesn't mean you are engaging in computational thinking. And the next claim that they debunk related to is computational thinking good for everyone is the claim that computational thinking will help in other subject areas. Now, there is no definitive answer on this. In fact, they cite Guzdial's 2015 report that basically says there's no evidence to support this. That was at 2015, and this article was written in 2017. So there has been some preliminary results that have said, well, there might be a correlation but we don't definitively actually know whether or not engaging in coding or computer science or computational thinking actually benefits students in those subject areas. If anything, we think it might not at least detract from those other subject areas. In other words, if you spend time on computational thinking, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to take away from your abilities to perform in other classes, even though you're spending less time in those other classes. Another lens that I've seen some people use is that, hey, if you're going to integrate computational thinking within that subject area, it at least doesn't hurt your ability to learn it. But we don't actually know for sure, does this actually improve learning the subject area? And if you have any articles that are more recent and actually point towards some causal relationships, please let me know. I'd love to read them. So the author closes this particular question by saying basically that the people who benefit from computational thinking are the people who design computations, and that the claim that other people outside of like computer science, computer programming, etc. will find this beneficial, the author argues that there's no evidence to support that it's actually beneficial for people who are not actively engaging in designing computations. So here's a quote that is from page 38. Quote, "Finally, it is worth noting that educators have long promoted a large number of different kinds of thinking. Engineering thinking, science thinking, economics thinking, systems thinking, logical thinking, rational thinking, network thinking, ethical thinking, design thinking, critical thinking, and more. Each academic field claims its own way of thinking. What makes computational thinking better than the multitude of other kinds of thinking? I do not have an answer." End quote. On page 38. So in the conclusion of this particular paper, the author is basically saying that computational thinking has been promoted to say that, oh, well, this is a great way for solving problems. And they say, well, maybe, but probably not, because not everybody who engages in creating or designing a computation is actually solving a problem. They might be doing it for the fun of it. They might be doing it out of concern, out of just a generic opportunity, etc. Check out page 39 for that argument. And on page 38, here's kind of a overall summary of the paper itself, which is a good way to kind of close out this description of this short paper. Quote, "My advice to teachers and education researchers is, use a HO's historically well-grounded definition and use competency-based skill assessment to measure student progress. Be wary of the claim of universal value, for it has little empirical support and draws you back to the vague definitions. Focus on helping students learn to design useful and reliable computations in various domains of interest to them. Leave the more advanced levels of computational design for education in the fields that rely heavily on computing." End quote. So that particular paragraph is a really good summary of this paper itself. Okay, so at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I'd like to kind of share some of my lingering questions or thoughts. So one lingering question that I have is, when is computational thinking a lens to look through, and when is it a process to engage in? So this is kind of going back to the skills versus understandings that the author describes in the second section of the paper. So I asked this question because I've seen computational thinking used as a way of thinking. So you are going to look at something and you're going to create some abstractions mentally of this thing, but you're not actually engaging in a process. You're not actually creating thing. You're not doing something. You're just kind of better understanding, which is fine. That might be helpful. However, I do like the author's argument that we should situate the computational thinking within computational modeling, so we're actually creating something with it. And one of the reasons why I would argue that is related to one of the final points that the author mentions, that there are many different ways of thinking through things, like why aren't we instead thinking musically, or biologically, or artistically, or whatever? Like, why is it assumed that computational thinking is superior in some way when it comes to problem solving or whatever you're using it for? As a field, I think that is something we really need to kind of grapple with. All right, so the next thought that I'll share is kind of a rant that I have. So this is a rant that I actually wrote down when giving some feedback to California's K-12 computer science standards. In particular, it is for the standard K-2.AP.10. Quote, "Algorithms are sequences of instructions that describe how to complete a specific task. Students create algorithms that reflect simple life tasks inside and outside the classroom. For example, students could create algorithms to represent daily routines for getting ready for school, transitioning through center rotations, eating lunch, and putting away art materials. Students could then write a narrative sequence of events. Alternatively, students could create a game or dance with a specific set of movements to reach an intentional goal or objective. Additionally, students could create a map of their neighborhood and give step-by-step directions of how to get to school." End quote. All right, so here's the written feedback that I gave on this particular one. Quote, "I think the map example is the best of the examples provided. However, I would encourage creating an example where kids actually create an algorithm with code rather than directions. I understand that CT researchers and practitioners are trying to bring CS discourse into other subject areas in everyday life, but I respectfully disagree that there is value added when we swap labels for concepts without consideration of context. For example, wouldn't we refer to step-by-step processes as directions for navigating an environment and a recipe for cooking pasta rather than an algorithm? I understand that semantically they can generally mean the same thing depending on the situated use. However, the difference between social, i.e. vernacular, and specialized, i.e. math, cooking, navigating, and CS, discourses they draw from are very different. Just because we can call something the same thing, it doesn't mean we should in all cases. For example, if we flip the CT narrative and started calling lines of code recipes or scores, if borrowing from Western European classical music discourse, I would argue this is using a label out of its proper context. I agree that kindergartners can follow a sequence of step-by-step instructions or processes throughout their day. However, I see algorithm as having a more specialized discursive use than the vernacular use of directions. For example, I might say an algorithm is like directions, which is like a recipe, but they are utilized in different contexts to mean similar but slightly different things. Step-by-step set of instructions for preparing food, which is different than directions being step-by-step set of instructions for navigating an environment, which is different than algorithms being step-by-step lines of code for a computer processor to execute, which is different than an algorithm being a step-by-step sequence of mathematical symbols and numbers to represent an object in motion, end quote. Okay, so that was probably more feedback than they wanted, and they probably saw it and ignored it. However, I wanted to share that with you to just kind of share some of my thoughts around computational thinking and how we really do need to consider the words that we are using, and just kind of arbitrarily labeling everything that resembles computer science concepts as a computer science concept is problematic. But that's just my thought. And if you disagree with me, I'd happy to interview you and have you talk with me on this podcast about your thoughts on computational thinking. Maybe we can create a panel of people who strongly disagree with me. I hope you enjoyed this particular episode. I know it was a little bit different than some of the Unpacking Scholarship episodes, and I highly recommend checking out the actual publication for this, which again you can find in the show notes. Stay tuned next week for another interview, and 2 weeks from now from another Unpacking Scholarship episode. Hope you're all having a wonderful week and are staying safe.